Those are my students looking for extra credit by applauding my... No, thank you. My name is Jay Carney. I'm not the press secretary for the president, but I am an assistant professor of theology here at Creighton, and it's my distinct honor to introduce an individual that I see as one of the great emerging theologians from Africa. Agbonkhianmeghe Oroabot is a Nigerian Jesuit currently serving in Kenya as the provincial of the Eastern Africa province of the Society of Jesus, a position he has held since 2009. An author, editor, and lecturer at Hekima College, the Jesuit School of Theology in Nairobi, Kenya, Father Oroabot specializes in ethics and theology in the church and religion in African society. He completed his doctorate in theology and religious studies in 2004 at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. His most recent work is, and wait for it, like academic work, sometimes they're really long, Practicing Reconciliation, Doing Justice, Building Peace. Conversations on Catholic Theological Ethics in Africa. It's published by Paulines in Africa in 2013. And this book addresses the mission of the church in the context of Africa's present socioeconomic, political, and religious context, also growing out of the recent Second African Synod based on similar themes. Forthcoming, Father Oroabot's helped to edit a collection entitled Feminism, Conversations in the World Church. And I would also highly recommend two of Father Oroabot's earlier theological works. I'll recommend them so much I'm going to pass around my own personal copies. But if you take them, I will find you, okay? The first is a revised version of his dissertation, I think perhaps the best work I've read on social ethics in Africa, From Crisis to Kairos, the mission of the church in the time of HIV/AIDS, refugees, and poverty. And then I think one of the best introductions to African theology, a very accessible book called Theology Brewed in an African Pot, published by Orbis in 2008. The title of Father Oroabot's lecture today is Vestiges and Legacies of Vatican II in the African Church. Father Oroabot, karibuni sana. You're most welcome. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much, Jay. And as we would say in the part of the world where I come from, asante sana. Thank you very much. And thank you to Eileen and to the rest of the colleagues here for the invitation to be part of this celebration. It's a special honor to talk about something that happened before I was born, but which has, in many ways, impacted on my own life. I didn't become a Christian until much later after Vatican II, but I would say that much of my experience of reflecting on what it means to be Catholic from an African background owes a lot to the influence of the Second Vatican Council, and some of that I would mention. I also am grateful that I'm speaking after Professor Peter Fan. Much of what he said yesterday relates a lot to the context and the situation in Africa. As I joked with him last night, all I need to do is just take out Asia and put Africa, and it will still be the same thing. But thank you very much. Speaking about Africa, it's important to note that this, as Peter Fan mentioned yesterday in the case of Asia, this is a very diverse continent. Sometimes when we think of Africa, we think of it as a single homogeneous entity. It is not. It is a continent, 54 countries, several languages, peoples, and cultures. And I do not pretend to speak for Africa. I do not pretend to present a view that captures the entire reality that is prevalent in Africa. I speak from a very, very specific perspective, and that is the situation or the context of Eastern Africa. Well, I come from Western Africa, but my home has been in the last 15 years in Eastern Africa. And that's also another gift that I've received from the Society of Jesus. What I want to demonstrate in this presentation is a very simple fact. And that is, we can only talk about legacies and vestiges of the council in Africa, precisely because, as many scholars have demonstrated, the council bypassed Africa. And this is a point that Peter Fan mentioned yesterday. One of the striking features of the council, at least looking at it from the perspective of the continent, is the insignificant number of Africans who actually were at the council. And when I say Africans, I mean those who were in positions of leadership. We're talking of a very, very small minority that attended and participated in the council. Now, this claim of underrepresentation, or this account of underrepresentation, would support the claim that Africa's involvement in the council was very limited, very limited. Yes, there were bishops who came from Africa to attend the council, but the majority of these were missionary bishops, mostly from Europe, and some of them from North America. The other thing that I find striking about the presence of Africa at the Vatican Council is the reticence, or rather the secondary roles assigned to or assumed by the expatriates and African-born representatives at the council. As one scholar has mentioned, the voices of African representatives at the council, the voices were sporadic. They were sporadic. And it cannot be said that the bishops from Africa exerted any decisive influence on the proceedings of the council. Reading John O'Malley's book, What Happened at the Second Vatican Council, he has a section of the book where he lists those who were frequently speaking and making interventions, who had the most number of interventions at the council. And you would notice that in that section, there is no single bishop from Africa who is mentioned as being one of those who were frequently making interventions or who took on significant responsibilities or roles in the proceedings of the council. So I make the point that Africa was neither fully present and active, nor was it totally absent and passive at the council. And I would try to unpack this in the course of this presentation. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that even though we make the claim that the church in Africa was not particularly active or represented at the council, it is also important to keep in mind that in the 1960s, you couldn't really be talking about the church, the African church. It was, even as late as the 1960s, a missionary church. And so you could talk about the church in Africa, but really not the church of Africa or the African church. So in that sense, it's important not to overplay the underrepresentation of the African church at the council. Now, added to that is the fact that the issues, the concerns, the agenda of the council really did not in any way address or substantially address the concerns of this missionary church. And so you could say that it was, as a church, an irrelevant entity at the council itself. There is an African theologian, the late Bishop Kalilombe, who makes this observation that from examining the 16 documents of the council, it's clear that it was largely a forum for the concerns of the churches of Europe and America in the 1960s. Africa's problems and preoccupations, therefore, came only indirectly and did not determine the central perspective from which the council's deliberations were moving. Now, when he says this, his claim is that, in one sense, the outlook of the council, and this goes very much in the direction of what Peter Fan said yesterday, the outlook was quite uniquely Eurocentric. And in that sense, you could say parochial, because even though this was the grand assembly of the world church, to use the term that Rana would use later, it really was narrowly focused on the concerns of the church in the West. And a scholar like John O'Malley would also corroborate Kalilombe's point that Europe, its concerns, and the legacy of its history provided the framework within which Vatican II operated. And so the story of the council is almost exclusively the story of Europeans fighting over issues arising out of European history. Besides all this, it is quite understandable then that when you look for materials, scholarly materials, on the council from an African perspective, it's very scant. You don't find a lot of materials devoted to the study of the impact or the influence of the Second Vatican Council on the continent of Africa. And there are some that are beginning to emerge. But that is also because this is the season, so to speak, when we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the council. And that has provided a lot of impetus to go back and begin to look at some of the documents, and as John O'Malley would say, to look at what happened at the council from the perspective, through the lenses of the church in Africa. Another point that I have recently come upon is what I would call the theological illiteracy and dogmatic immunity or resistance to change that characterize the hierarchy of the church in Africa during and after the council. A scholar like Adrian Hastings makes this very insightful remark that, some of the technicalities of the council's documents and the issues that were fought over were really, in a sense, strange or hard or difficult for some of the bishops from the continent to comprehend. The intrigues, the politics, the intricacies of the whole process and the documentation was a bit of a challenge for some of the bishops to understand. That even after the council, one of the biggest challenges that we faced on the continent was how to translate the document into a language that is understandable, that is from the Latin to a language that will be easily understandable in different parts of the continent. As I said earlier on, a conference like this, a celebration like this of the legacy of the Second Vatican Council provides yet another impetus to go back and study and revisit the council and try to tease out some of the elements from the council that has shaped what we now call the African church. So mine this afternoon is to do a retrospective study, therefore, relying on the benefit of what I would call a certain methodological hindsight in assessing, identifying, and assessing some of the vestiges and legacies of the Second Vatican Council in Africa. Again, to go back to Patrick Kalilombe, the late bishop from Malawi, he also makes the point that the reaction of the church in Africa to Vatican II was a kind of a delayed reaction. It's only with time that this church began to see and to appreciate what this event of the council meant to it. And so there was a process of gradual appropriation, gradual discovery, gradual integration of some of the elements of the Second Vatican Council into the shaping of the identity, the mission, the theology of the church in Africa. Now, according to Kalilombe, at first, the African church seemed simply to follow the Western responses to the Concilia program. But it's only later, especially beginning with the mid-1970s, and thanks to the growing influence of SECAM, that is the body of bishops, conferences of bishops on the continent, there has begun to emerge a specifically African response to Vatican II. My question then is, how do we identify this specifically African response? What constitutes this specifically African response to the Second Vatican Council? And I make the point that 50 years later, we need to be quite clear about how we identify and describe this specifically African response. I want to repeat the point that while the temptation is strong to do so, I want to be careful not to exaggerate the non-participation and the underrepresentation of the church in Africa at the council. And I also want to resist the temptation to simply castigate and gratuitously criticize the African participants at the council for not perhaps being more vocal, more active, more engaged. Because we have to take into account the historical context of the continent at the time of the council. One of the points to note in terms of the historical context of the council, of the continent at the time of the council, is that, in a sense, the council was not the priority. In the 1960s, the priority on the continent was decolonization. That was where the focus was. Decolonization in the political landscape, but also filtering into the religious landscape. That was the focus, decolonization. And which gradually would become, in terms of the configuration of the churches, become what they call the moratorium debate. The idea that this church needed to develop its own identity, develop its own resources, and not be solely, totally dependent on its the mother churches. So in that sense, again, it's important to realize that there were other significant developments taking place on the continent at the time of the council. Significant in the sense that these were developments that really drew on the energies and the focus and the resources of the Africans across the board. And chief among these developments was the whole process of decolonization. Historically, as we know, several of the African countries around the time of the council were clamoring for and actually acceding to independence. My key point, however, is that, yes, there was an event, the Second Vatican Council. If we consider it from the African perspective as an event, it is easy for us to say, well, it was not something that was of interest to us or that we were engaged in or that we were part of, etc., etc. But that is considering it as an event in history. My position would be to look at it as a process in history. In other words, as a reality that set in motion a process that for decades would gradually shape and define the self-understanding of the church in Africa, its mission, its theology, etc. So for me then, I think it would be justifiable to consider Vatican II not simply as an event or a moment in history, monumental as it was, but essentially as a process in history. I believe that when we do this, the whole question of Africa's participation or the relationship between the Council and Africa takes on a different perspective. And I will come back to that in a short while. So central to my claim that it's for us, it represents more a process than an event, is the insight that this process was not exclusive to the dominant actors, personalities, and churches of Eurocentric mindset that shaped the agenda, conducted the debates, fought the conflicts, and produced the original documents of the Council. On the contrary, this process of ecclesial growth and maturation has unfolded over at least 5 decades and has aptly validated Karl Rahner's insight that the Council's enduring legacy can best be perceived and appreciated in the emergence of a truly world church. Again, I come back to the point that Peter Fan made yesterday, that the Council represented that first movement towards this reality that we now designate as world church. John Allen, the journalist, looks at it from a different perspective, from a sociological perspective. And he makes the point that when you look at the development of Christianity in the global south, the way he would categorize it is that, very simply, the history of Roman Catholicism in one sentence in the 20th century is very simply the center of gravity shifted from the north to the south. And again, I rejoin the point that Peter Fan made yesterday. So when we study then the vestiges and legacies of Vatican II in Africa, we are visiting the Council's historical trajectory and trying to reveal how the African church has been a part of this historical progress and theological progression originated by Vatican II. So where do we look for these vestiges and legacies of the Council in Africa? Where do we see those signs or evidence that this process initiated by the Council has unfolded over the last 50 years and therefore had a significant impact in shaping the identity, the mission, and a theological self-understanding of the church in Africa. Where do we see these vestiges? I would like to identify 4 key elements or areas where we perceive this process initiated by Vatican II having a significant impact on the church in Africa. Yesterday, Peter Fan mentioned the fact that one of the documents, the shortest document, in fact, has become, from the perspective of the Global South, perhaps one of the most significant documents. That's Nostra Aetate. Now, that's the document on the relationship between the church and Christianity and non-Christian religion. When you read that document, it makes no reference to the religion that, that I'm familiar with. That's the background of my own religious consciousness. That's African religion. It talks about the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Islam, talks about Buddhism. But then it has this curious phrase about those who seek God in shadows and images. Now, friends, that's where I come in. That's what I'm familiar with. That's the way Vatican II described me before I became a Catholic. Those who seek God in shadows and images. Now, and that's not a very flattering way to describe someone's religious experience. But anyway, that's what Nostra Aetate tells us. But what you see, though, is that because of this understanding that there is in fact, or there are in fact other ways of seeking the face of God, even if in shadows and images. Because of that realization, what happens is that there emerges sort of a growing recognition that African religious traditions possessed a kind of a genius, an imagination that could in fact generate a variety of Christianity that would be at once attuned to centuries of Christian traditions, beliefs, and practices in the church, and also consciously and carefully be adapted to the local context. So this idea will generate a series of theological and liturgical experimentations that I would say owe their origin to the change of attitude initiated by Vatican II. 2 years after the council, Pope Paul VI, we heard a lot about him yesterday, issued a document called Africae Terrarum, Message to the Countries of Africa. This document extolled the ancient glories of Christian Africa, but also called the church to give attentive consideration to the moral and religious values of ancient African religious cultures. So there is now a movement from simply that derogatory approach that sees only shadows and images in this to a call to give attentive consideration to the values, moral and religious, in African religious cultures. A significant shift, I would say. Now, this insightful document that Paul VI put out, this message to the countries of Africa, I would argue, lies on that slow but conscious axis of a fundamental attitudinal change that Vatican II initiated. when you look at the document that Paul VI put out, this message to the countries of Africa, and you compare this document with Nostra Aetate, that is the declaration on the relation between the church and non-Christian religions, you would find that there are resemblances between the two documents. The way it's formulated, the issues that are dealt with, the kind of attitude that you find there are resemblances. A key declaration of Nostra Aetate is this statement that the Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in these religions. She regards with sincere reverence those ways of conduct and of life, those precepts and teachings which, though differing in many aspects from the ones she holds and sets forth, nonetheless often reflect a ray of that truth which enlightens all men, all people. Now, as I said earlier on, when Nostra Aetate talks about these religions, it doesn't refer to African religion, except, of course, when it talks about those who seek God in shadows and images. But what I think Paul VI did was to translate this declaration, Nostra Aetate, to translate it into an African context, and therefore undercutting the prevailing beliefs and practices of missionary Christianity that summarily demonized African religious traditions and cultures. That's what I think Paul VI did, to translate this document, or this position, or this attitude into an African context, and therefore counter that prevailing attitude of demonizing African religious traditions by missionary Christianity. And so, Paul VI wrote to the churches in Africa that the church views with great respect the moral and religious values of the African tradition, not only because of their meaning, but also because the church sees them as providential, as the basis of spreading the gospel message and beginning the establishment of the new society in Christ. And that is why the African who becomes a Christian does not disown himself or herself, but takes up the age-old values of tradition in spirit and in truth. If I had a bit more time, I would speak about how this final statement, the final sentence of this statement, describes my experience as an African who has become Christian, but refusing to disown myself and the age-old values of my religious background. But that's for another conversation. Laurenti Magesa is a Tanzanian theologian, well-respected, and he has demonstrated in his study of the history and practice of enculturation in Africa that many African Christians attribute this change in attitude to the Second Vatican Council as that watershed moment between strict intolerance and a limited official acceptance of aspects of an African spirituality in the church. Magesa uses an interesting imagery, which he calls opening the door. For him, Vatican II slightly opened the door for consideration of African religion as a dialogue partner. So that if we can talk about interreligious dialogue on the continent today, that reality can be traced back to this gradual opening of the door. And hence the title of this section, Opening the Door to Shadows and Images. In the last 50 years, this door has opened even wider as African theologians undertake a series of penetrating analyses and studies of the age-old values of African religion and attempt to correlate them with the core beliefs of Christianity. I don't want to dwell too much on this, but I also believe that the fact that we can talk about African theology today is an offshoot of this process. Because prior to Vatican II, African theology was told and recounted by proponents of missionary Christianity. After Vatican II, that's when you begin to hear African voices articulating what theology means in an African context. One of my favorite proverbs is that, until the lion has its own historians, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunters. That's something similar that has happened on the continent because of the process set in place by Vatican II. That today, there are African voices able to articulate what some of these age-old values of African religions are, and correlating that, therefore, to the core beliefs and tenets of Christianity. And so, the single most important event, I believe, to emerge through this door is the movement of enculturation, which has become quite central both as a methodology and as a content in African theology today. Enculturation, which focuses on and investigates the encounter between gospel and culture in Christian life. A process which then allows the gospel to discover itself in our culture, accepting the elements that reveal the face of God already present and rejecting those that do not reveal the face of God. I saw a book yesterday. The author is here, Tom Kelly. I think it's entitled When the Gospel Takes Feet, Grows Feet, yeah. It reminded me of this process of enculturation, where the gospel grows feet and walks, in freedom, in totally different contexts from where it originates. That process that we will routinely call enculturation is a reality on the African continent, at least in African theology, that is firmly rooted in the change in focus and attitude initiated by Vatican II. There are shortcomings and there are debates about the importance or the significance of enculturation. I will pass over that and move to the next point. So liturgical innovation or liturgical adaptation. What happened after Vatican II in Africa? Now, when you sample opinion among scholars and commentators and theologians on the continent on the legacy of Vatican II for liturgical adaptation, reform, and enculturation in Africa, you would find that there is a lack of consensus. There is a lack of consensus in the sense that Africa does not seem to have taken seriously the call of Vatican II, especially in the document Sacrosanctum Concilium, for liturgical reforms and creativity. Now, you would think that given the rich cultural heritages and traditions of this continent, that Africa would be strategically positioned to take full advantage of the favorable conditions and lead the liturgical innovations and transformations encouraged by Vatican II. There are those who believe that it missed this opportunity. And so the spectrum of appraisal of Africa's response to this mandate of Vatican II would range from, on the one hand, relatively insignificant adaptations, to the other hand, a liturgical revolution of immense practical and pastoral significance. If you ask me where I stand on this, I would say that, yes, there was reticence, but there has been, I would say, significant liturgical creativity, again, arising from the impetus created by Vatican II. What the Council mandated for the Universal Church, I believe, Paul VI, again, explicitly permitted to the church in Africa. In another setting, while engaging the hierarchy of the continent, Paul VI made this declaration 2 years after the council. You may and you must have an African Christianity. Indeed, you possess human values and characteristic forms of culture which can rise up to perfection, such as to find in Christianity and for Christianity a true superior fullness and prove to be capable of a richness of expression, all of its own and genuinely African. There is a tendency to detect and to decry an apparent timidity in the ranks of African ecclesiastical hierarchy in leading liturgical innovations authorized by Vatican II. I take the position that when you look at the available evidence, it supports the view of a modest but important innovation rather than insignificant adaptations. When you look at some of the experimentations that have happened in DR Congo with the Zairian liturgy, or in Cameroon, in West Africa or Nigeria, and now in parts of Eastern and Central Africa, there is certainly a movement of liturgical innovation and liturgical creativity that still continues to draw its inspiration from some of the movements unhinged by Vatican II. Now, the existing evidence of constructive experimentation and creativity in liturgical celebration and worship on the continent can be traced directly to the motivation and the warrants sanctioned by Vatican II. My third example is the development of small Christian communities. In the 1970s, the Association of Member Episcopal Conferences of Eastern Africa, which consists of the Episcopal Conferences of 9 East African conferences, adopted small Christian communities as a pastoral strategy for advancing the mission of evangelization. And again, these bishops of the AMESEA countries have renewed their confidence in small Christian communities and as a means of achieving newer and deeper evangelization of Africa. My point is, the origin, the development, and the practice of small Christian communities drew inspiration from the emphasis of Vatican II on the local church. Again, I underline a point that Peter Fan made very, very clearly yesterday, the idea of a church that is a local church that is wholly church, but not the only church. Now, this is very true in the way the small Christian communities were developed in Africa, especially in Eastern Africa. There is a commentator, De Jong, a Dutch church historian, who has said that the rediscovery of the local church in the ecclesiology of Vatican II exercised a strong influence on the young churches of Africa. These young churches were moving out of the missionary period and engaged in finding their own ecclesial identity as local churches within the universal church. Now, how did this happen? In the understanding of the bishops of Eastern Africa, the small Christian communities were meant to be cells where the Christian faith would be intensely lived and intensely shared. They were in fact seen as the ecclesiastical extension of the African extended family or clan. Now, understood as such, small Christian communities over the years, since the mid-70s, have emerged and flourished as the most concrete and visible manifestation of the community called church in the local context. In the local context. And I say this especially for Eastern Africa. The Marinola Joe Healy, who has considerable authority on this, has estimated that there are as many as 120,000 small Christian communities in Eastern Africa. And in Kenya, he counts about 45,000 small Christian communities, which are considered, to use a term coined by Rodrigo Mejia, the former bishop of Sodo Hosanna Diocese in Ethiopia, as the church in the neighborhood. The church in the neighborhood. And in this sense, you could say that they embody and fulfill the ecclesiology of the local church, according to Vatican II, especially in the understanding that the Church of Christ is really present in all legitimately organized groups of the faithful, insofar as they are united to their pastors and are also quite appropriately called churches in the New Testament. You could look at the importance of small Christian communities in a variety of ways. But in Eastern Africa, at least, the assessment of theologians of these communities has been quite positive, especially when they are seen today as the new way of being church that draws on the resources and draws on the genius of the local community to create a community that is, to quote Joe Healy, a church on the move under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Now, in talking about the successes of small Christian communities, I don't want to gloss over some of the shortcomings. Perhaps some of us who've visited the continent, especially Eastern Africa, you've seen how it operates. There is a very strong clericalist control of small Christian communities. There is dominance of patriarchy in the leadership structures, even though the majority of the members tend to be women. And of course, there is a near total absence of youth participation in small Christian communities. But again, my point remains that these communities began to emerge in the mid-70s specifically in response to the whole idea generated, or at least contained, in some of the documents of Vatican II relating to the importance of the local church and what that means. My fourth and final point that I would use as an illustration of what Vatican II put, the process initiated by Vatican II, is the synodal process. after Vatican II, there was a flurry of activities to basically aimed at disseminating the teachings of Vatican II in various dioceses of the subcontinent. And one of these activities was the whole practice of diocesan synod, which I still am yet to find any evidence of that happening before Vatican II. But after Vatican II, we started to have these synods, first to discuss the consequences of Vatican II for the local dioceses, and then to draw up a plan of pastoral implementation of the teachings of Vatican II. Now, these attempts historically were rather short-lived. By the mid-80s, practically the diocesan synods had faded away. They still happen, but not on the same scale as they did in the period immediately after Vatican II. But with the passing of the years, there are two significant initiatives that have taken place or have happened on the continent that I would trace again directly to Vatican II. And these are the two African synods. First, the 1994 synod, and second, the synod of 2009. Now, Meghe makes the point that perhaps the most important consequence of Vatican II for African Catholicism was the convocation of, in 1994, of the Special Assembly of the Synod of Bishops for Africa, or the African Synod, almost 3 decades after the closing of the council. And I agree with him. Because as I said earlier on, there was a gradual realization that this process, which brought together the hierarchy and the rest of the community, represented another form, another tool in the church, ecclesiastical tool, for strengthening the bond of the community called church. And this will gradually build up and culminate in the two synods that we had. And these were synods or events that had significant impact on the nature, the identity, the theology, the mission of the church on the continent. The first synod in 1994 focused on the identity of the church and came up with this idea of church as family. In other words, taking the church as God's family as a guiding idea for the evangelization of Africa. The Synod Fathers acknowledged it as an expression of the church's nature particularly appropriate for Africa. There are several manuscripts or monographs that have been developed on this theme of the church as family in Africa. And it also relates to the idea and the practice of small Christian communities as an extension of the African idea of family or clan. The second synod focused on the mission of the church in the area of reconciliation, justice, and peace. And as the synod declared, in this light we accept our responsibility to be instruments of reconciliation, justice, and peace in our communities, ambassadors for Christ, who is our peace and our reconciliation. What is interesting, and I find this interesting, is that both synods have generated considerable developments in ecclesiology, in Christology, and in social ethics in African theology. So, These are the 4 examples that I would identify that allow us to see the enduring legacy of Vatican II on the continent of Africa. And in saying this, I do not intend that these are the only ones, but these are rather illustrations of this. So let me make some concluding remarks. So go back to John O'Malley in his book, What Happened at Vatican II. He says, what is striking about Vatican II is not any prominent role played by the new churches or the young churches of former colonies, but its dominance by Europeans. Now, on the basis of this observation, as I have mentioned earlier on, it is tempting to draw the conclusion that Vatican II had little or no significance for Africa. Now, this conclusion relies heavily on the perception of the Council as primarily an event, a moment in history. Now, when you look at it in a different light, in a different optic, it is possible to understand it as a process of history. And in that sense, Vatican II served as a catalyst for theological developments and changes that have defined the identity and shaped the mission of the church in Africa in the 50 years since the close of the council. And so when we ask the question, how did these changes come about? What necessitated the birth of small Christian communities, the use of the vernacular, secular music, and participatory leadership? Very simply, it was the Second Vatican Council that officially initiated the process. Anybody familiar with the continent today would realize that the situation of the African church has changed dramatically since the close of the council. From a mission church that appeared too timid to assert its identity and raise its voice at this grand assembly of the world church. So what is very clearly today a vibrant church that, in the words of Emeritus Pope Benedict XVI, constitutes an immense spiritual lung for a humanity that appears to be in a crisis of faith and hope. In brief, one of the key conclusions that I would draw from this presentation is the conviction that far from being unintended consequences, the exponential expansion, the vibrancy of ministry, the liturgical creativity, and the theological developments, not forgetting the entrenched patriarchal proclivities and conservative leanings that now characterize the African church today, owe their original impulse to the process, the influence, and the spirit of Vatican II that continue to animate, motivate, and support the demographic and theological flourishing of the African church. The approach that I have adopted and the examples that I have considered in this presentation make clear that rather than being mere vestiges or traces, these developments now constitute revealing testaments to the legacy of Vatican II and permanent features of a lively and dynamic ecclesia in Africa. Thank you for your kind and patient attention.
Asante sana. As our panelists are coming up, I'd like to ask, what we're moving into now is some responses actually from students here at Creighton who've engaged the African context in different levels. In the meantime, we've been listening, we've been sitting, and one thing I always appreciate when I am in Africa is the communal sense and the activity and the vibrancy. So I'm going to ask you to please stand and please greet anyone at your table that you do not know. And if you know everyone, greet them again. So, Adam, this is your chance. Come on up. Go ahead. Are you more comfortable speaking at the podium? Podium? Okay. Okay, good. Nice. Okay, good, good. Okay, good. That's fine. And then I don't care what order you go. Since we're in an American context, we must keep time. So I'll ask you to please return to your seats, unless you're a student sneaking out of here. It's okay. Safari and Jama. That's safe travels. Okay. I'd like to take a moment just to introduce our three student respondents. These are all Barbara Reardon Haney student scholars who have been chosen to respond to Father Oroabotor's address. I'll introduce them all together, and then they will take turns presenting. Afterward, we'll invite Father Oroabotor back up here, along with our panelists, to all take any questions that you may have. So first, nearest to me is Adam Goodrick. Adam's a native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He's currently a junior here at Creighton University. His major is mathematics with a minor in theology, and he's on the pre-medicine track. There are very, very few students at Creighton on that track, I should add. So, just kidding. Last summer, he had the privilege of studying abroad with me. No, he had the privilege of studying abroad in Tanzania. I could speak very highly. It was wonderful to have Adam on a course with us, and he'll be speaking some on his reflections from his experience in Tanzania today. In the future, Adam plans to attend medical school with the hope of one day returning to Africa to put his medical training to good use. A Minnesota native, Catherine "Cat" Keating, finished her undergraduate degree in philosophy and justice and peace studies here at Creighton in 2010. She then joined the Jesuit Volunteer Corps and served in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania for 2 years, where she taught in the local Jesuit primary school, was very active in the community, and will be reflecting on that with us. She is now doing a master's here in conflict mediation with the Werner Institute here at Creighton, and also is working at the Creighton Center for Service and Justice. And finally, Father Vincent Sunguti is a diocesan priest, originally from the Diocese of Eldoret in Kenya. He completed degrees in theology and philosophy from St. Augustine's and St. Thomas Aquinas seminaries in Kenya. He was ordained as a Catholic priest in 2001 and spent the next decade doing pastoral work in his home diocese in Kenya, much of which will provide his reflections today. Now, Father Sunguti is here with us at Creighton. He's working on both a master's in Christian spirituality as well as a master's of theology. He has assisted at multiple churches in Omaha and is currently also the chaplain for the African Catholic community based at the old St. Gerard's in South Omaha. For those of you who went to the liturgy today, if you enjoyed that, I strongly encourage you to join them on the first and third Sunday of the month. So we welcome all our panelists, and we'll begin today with Adam Goodrick.
Thank you. We are in the middle of a love story. Each of us is connected in this chain of love. And if we do not understand this, we understand nothing of what church is. Pope Francis encourages us to embrace this love story. Paul VI called upon Africa, saying that they must create their own African Christianity, and in a sense, enter into this love story. Last summer, I had the privilege of studying abroad in Tanzania, where I was able to witness firsthand this love story. It is in the experiences of watching the Mass and observing many people that I was able to see and get a greater understanding of the universal church. I'd first like to mention how I see African society working. African culture is unique in many aspects. The most apparent characteristic is the communal society. There is a well-known African proverb that sums this up quite literally. It states, "I am because we are." There is a common interest for the other. When talking about God, big theological concepts are not necessarily discussed. Instead, the Ignatian value of finding God in all things is what really matters to the African people. The goods and services that the church provides for the families in need are really where the African people see God. Father Robotar uses the family motto, which the African Senate put into place. And I think this is a great example of noticing this tangible theology that I'm talking about here. In the small Christian communities, we see this working great because they do resemble this family motto. During my time abroad, I observed many masses, and during this time, I was able to experience a liturgy much different than my own. I saw Mass in large city settings and also in rural parishes. It was here that the theology that I talked about earlier was expressed. I've never really experienced a Mass outside of the English language, so to get used to the Swahili at first was quite difficult. But luckily, with the Universal Catholic Mass, it became quite easy. The opening hymns were sung with people dancing and clapping. The Mass took the form of a celebration rather than the usual Sunday obligation. 4 young girls, who were students at the nearby school, led the procession at the beginning. They had a very unique way of dancing down the aisle as the altar boy and the priest followed. The dancing did not stop. At the preparation of the gifts, the girls danced in front of the altar, as if they were calling down the Spirit. I see the communal aspect when the sign of the peace came, and everyone in the church seemed to have shaken hands with each other. At the end of the Mass, there were three songs played in conclusion, each of which not a single person left before the songs had finished. So what did this say about my experience? First, and most obvious, the Mass was viewed as a celebration. The joy stems from the common appreciation for life that I think most Africans share. Second, in the dancing, I saw traditional centuries of tribal ceremonies. Last, I saw the communal society and each person greeting each other as they went up for the sign of peace. Opening this door to the African traditions through enculturation, as Father Robotar states, really allows the Mass to become more personalized to the African people and allows them to get more out of the Mass. Let us recall Paul VI's invitation for the African church to develop their own Christianity, as Father Robotar quoted, and I will quote again here. You may and you must have an African Christianity. Indeed, you possess the human values and characteristic forms of culture which can rise up to the perfection, such as to find in Christianity and for Christianity a true superior fullness, and prove to be capable of the richness of expression, all its own and genuinely African. It is in the liturgies that I've witnessed and the theology that I observed and discussed that I saw the African Christianity that Paul called for 48 years ago. It is here that the African Church fulfills the words of the Vatican II document of Gaudium et Spes when it says, since the Church has a visible and social structure as a sign of her unity with Christ, she can and ought to be enriched by the development of human social life. Not that there is any lack in the constitution given her by Christ, but that she can understand it more penetratingly, express it better, and adjust it more successfully to our times. It is by creating this African church that I saw the African church truly thriving. According to Pew Research, in the last 100 years, the number of Catholics in sub-Saharan Africa has increased from 1% to 16%. Priestly vocations are up 2% worldwide, and most analysis will say that that's due to the boom in vocations, specifically in Africa and Asia. When I returned from my trip abroad, it was natural for me to do some reflection. I compared a lot. I compared my home parish, the community here at St. John's, and a variety of other parishes that I've experienced here in the States. I found that Africa and America are different, obviously. They have different poverties, different issues, and different ways of going about life. By no means is one better than the other, but I will say that there's a lot that both perspectives can gain from each other. I was reading a homily written by Pope Francis when he refers to the church as a love story. A church has a deep relationship with his followers, and it was easy to see this in the African church. As the small communities I experienced looked forward to church on Sunday and made the parish literally the center of their village. The relationship of her church and her people is grounded in love. We as Christians in the global perspective are called to go out into the world spreading this love through Jesus Christ. The church in turn expresses her love to us through the sacraments which she invites us all to take part in. In general, I experienced this love story firsthand in Africa through observing the joyful celebration of the Mass and the generosity and happiness expressed in so many of the people. Let me refer back to the quote that I began with, that Pope Francis refers to the church as. He says, "We are in the middle of this love story. Each of us is a link in this chain of love, and if we do not understand this, we understand nothing of what church is." It was in Africa that I experienced a new understanding of church, a church linked in chains of love, and I found myself in the middle of it. Thank you.
Salam Maria, umejaa neema, Bwana yu nawe, umebarikiwa kuliko wanawake wote, na Yesu mzao wa tumbo lako amebarikiwa. At about 6 a.m. many Saturday mornings while I was living in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, I'd hear these words called out by one of my neighbors approximately 53 times. These are the words of the first half of the Kiswahili version of the Hail Mary. On these mornings of intense rosary praying, I attended my neighborhood's small Christian community called Jumuiya in Kiswahili. As mentioned, I had the privilege of living in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania from December 2010 to 2012 as a teacher at a primary school, Jesuit primary school, through Jesuit Volunteer Corps. I feel blessed to be able to share some of my reflections with you from my time there, focusing mainly on my experience with the local Catholic Jesuit parish, St. John the Baptist, of which I was a member and also a participant of a number of programs associated with the parish. One such program was the above-mentioned Jumuiya, the small Christian community that Father Oroabot highlighted for us in his talk. He articulated some of the most important theoretical aspects of the Jumuiya, why it is a profound example of Christian and Catholic church, and also why Jumuiya's uniquely African aspects add great depth to its meaning for the ecclesiology of the church. Father Oroabot emphasized that Jumuiya is church in the neighborhood, or church from the bottom up, and church as the extension of the African family or clan. I would confirm these descriptions of Jumuiya because I find that they resonate greatly with my personal experience. I think that these portrayals can come alive by walking through a typical Saturday morning Jumuiya meeting with you as I lived it. To set the stage, my Jumuiya community gathered early in the morning at 6 a.m., very fitting for my early rising Tanzanian friends, right outside in front of someone's house. We would quietly greet each other, the other members of the group, while we found our places. Men and older women generally sat on plastic chairs, while women and children sat on a number of mats placed on the ground. We were a community of about 30 close neighbors, though our meetings generally consisted of about 15 people. And our group was led by a number of mothers, the matriarch of who was Mama Musa, the lady in the middle of that picture. And she had kind of an apprentice or matriarch in training, Mama Baraka. We would begin with the rosary. One member of the group would lead, and we would respond. This was then followed usually by a lively song and dance before the scriptures readings for the day were read. Then everyone was welcome to share their thoughts or ideas about the reading with the group. A very just authentic, organic conversation happened. A collection was always passed around, and members were asked to contribute what they could. The collection of money was occasionally saved and put away for further events, but was usually used to visit a sick or struggling member of the Jumuiya group. Perhaps a neighborhood family had recently lost a loved one. Or maybe a happy event had occurred. Someone had a baby, or there was a confirmation. Such as in this photo, one of my students, whose family was in my Jumuiya, was having a confirmation, and our Jumuiya collected and used those funds to celebrate her confirmation. She came from a family who couldn't afford a celebration themselves. So one member might receive the contribution one Saturday, and then come to the Jumuiya the next, and contribute and then use that money to help the next struggling member the next Saturday. It was an incredibly beautiful thing to witness and be a part of, even for a brief time. In this sense, the members were taking care of one another in a very, very intimate and very uniquely African, familial, or clan-like way. I attended each Jumuiya with a few of my best young neighborhood friends, one of whom is Dixon, a 20-year-old participant who I think was going to be a great leader in his Jumuiya as he ages. But all in all, we were a mixture of people, of families, young and old. Everyone was welcome and encouraged to attend. The parish, St. John the Baptist, relied heavily on the community that was built by these Jumuiyas. When the parish was devastated by floods at the end of 2011, it was the many Jumuiya groups who cleaned, did the fundraising, and repaired the church. The Jumuiyas found ways to help members who had lost homes and possessions. It was the Jumuiyas that organized the mourning processes for those who had tragically lost loved ones. The Jumuiyas at St. John's the Baptist Church were strong and powerful, and they are honored every year during an almost 6-hour-long Mass, where each and every person in the parish who's involved in a Jumuiya is announced and recognized for their participation in that community. It's quite a feat for all of the parishioners, and especially the parish priest. So there are many, many beautiful aspects of the Jumuiya that portray Father Robitor's highlighted points of familial care for all members, bottom-up movement and participation, and neighborhood-centeredness. My experience there only confirms to me these refreshing and important descriptions. I think that the Tanzanian concept of Jumuiya